Hey everybody, this is the House of Shade, and today's episode is hosted by Red Eyed Bear and features the CorePeg research team responsible for the development of Shade Protocol's algorithmic stablecoin, Silk. In today's episode, we meet the CorePeg research team, discuss Silk's utility and role in the protocol, take a deep dive into the development of the Silk currency basket, and find out what makes Silk unique from every other stablecoin in existence. Now let's join Red Eyed Bear for our second episode of House of Shade.
All right, and we're live. All right, thank you guys for taking the time to join me and come here and talk about Silk and do a deep dive into it. Today, we're joined by Admiral, Airman, and Florida Man. Again, thank you guys for coming. I know that there's a lot of hype about Silk launching, and people are really interested to know how Silk is composed. So I think this is going to be a really, really good episode for the community. Not to disparage any of the other previous or future topics that we plan on covering, but to me, this episode carries a little bit of extra gravitas in my mind, just because this is like the perfect episode to exemplify how the community can come together to better a project. Like, you've got community-based education, which House of Shade is trying to take on, and you've also got these community-based work group that's building out this core product for the protocol that's going to be this flagship product. So like, how much more community oriented and focused could a protocol be, which I think is super cool. So before we get started with the content and the topic that we're talking about today, which is Silk and the Silk currency basket, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of a chance to talk about your educational and professional backgrounds and kind of how that helps you work on the PEG research team. So maybe Florida Man, if you want to kick it off.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Red Eyed Bear, thanks so much for having us on the podcast. It's truly an honor to be on one of the first episodes here. So really excited about what you all are doing, and just can't wait to see Shade Protocol and Silk just really bring forth all these great ideas in the coming months. So yeah, to sum up real quick, my background, I finished my master's degree here in the U.S. Studying economics with a focus towards the commodity side. And my professional career currently, over the past 8 or 10 years, has had me studying a lot global power shifts through different economies. And I've stayed close to the capital markets more on a personal level, but it's always been a deep interest of mine since studying economics in college. And I just saw this opportunity to contribute, and it was so exciting to me to be able to kind of merge some of the passions and skill that I had into a crypto project with a fantastic group of developers.
That's awesome. Admiral, you want to go?
Yeah, for me, I did a master's in public policy around 10 years ago or so. That includes a lot of economics, like for the purpose of like government policy and so on. So I have a consultancy that's based out of Singapore. We do a lot of work in things like import and export policy advising for various agencies, like whether it's like a regional government or a national government. We also work on things related to tech policy, fintech policy, this kind of thing. So I'm kind of connected to the crypto space kind of indirectly. My kind of focus, my expertise, if I have any, is more related to like how government policy works, monetary policy, okay, and so on. So that's basically what I do, and how I've been trying to contribute to this project. I'd also like to say it's like a huge honor. It's really exciting to be on this podcast with you guys, and it's been a really fun process so far. A lot of really great contributions from many people on this research, both people who kind of sort of formed a bit of like the core research team, as well as people that popped in here and there with very good questions and very good input intermittently and so on as well. So it's great to be here.
Glad to have you. Erdeman?
Yeah, so I'm finishing my master's in physics as we speak, and I'm focusing on data science and machine learning in that as well. So I'm more from the data science side in that sense. And I worked for a company where I created commodity yield forecasts. So forecast what the yield would be for the economic season and how they use this to create several economic models for the price of these commodities. And that's where my interest in these kinds of topics started a little bit. And then when I started my crypto journey, I guess, earlier last year, I walked more along this path and then met Florida Man and Admiral to discuss the Silk Pack in the Discord. So that's where it all started.
I've just got to say, I think it's so cool to me to get to talk to people like you guys, because talking to you guys is such an incredible educational opportunity, at least for me, and I'm sure a lot of other community members that don't have any professional or formal education in economics or finance or any sort of data science. Personally, my formal education background is in physics and chemistry, and I unfortunately didn't take any formal classes on economics or finance or business development. So all of my learning has had to come post-education, which I kind of like because I got to choose my own direction, the things that interest me most, but it definitely was a lot harder building that base. So getting to talk to people like you guys who are very approachable, very nice, and very well educated, it's a phenomenal opportunity. So we're going to be going into a little bit of the background of the properties of Silk and a little bit of its token architecture, and then going into a deep dive on the Silk currency basket and the logic behind its development, as well as some of the implications of its development in the greater DeFi space. So I guess best place to start would be to give a little background on Silk. I know not everyone that's going to end up being I know everyone that is going to end up listening to this is not necessarily a new person to Shade Protocol, but it doesn't hurt to give a little bit of a refresher to those who are already in the know. And this will also help give a decent base of knowledge for anyone who is just now getting exposed to Silk. So Silk is the first ever privacy preserving smart contract interoperable stablecoin in blockchain history that's launching on Shade Protocol. And I love making this statement just because it still kind of gives me chills saying that something is a world first. Like, gotta love that there. And Silk is built on secret network and made possible via the SNP20 private and fungible token standard. And that SNP20 token standard is what allows Silk to maintain transactional privacy for all token holders. Silk has the four key fundamental properties of money. Those four properties are: it functions as a medium of exchange, a store of value, a unit of account, and a standard of deferred payment. And through the nature of its composition and its architecture, Silk is credibly neutral, distributed, and has transactional privacy by default. All of those things, those last three things I said, credibly neutral, distributed, and transactional privacy by default, those are all three very, very important topics to hit. And the one that I personally want to cover a little bit here is the transactional privacy by default. But you also have the ability to be transparent by choice, which is, it's so important. It's so important because when we're talking about bringing on institutional users, larger scale adoption, we need to make sure that there's a path for compliance and transparency. And I think you guys would be able to provide a little bit of extra information on why this is such a critical aspect for Silk in regards to getting that large scale adoption.
Sure, absolutely, Red-Eyed Bear. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, and it, like Carter and so many other of the developers of Shade and Silk have mentioned many times, it's very difficult for the crypto ecosystem to grow as many dreamed it would grow into years ago without that privacy. And Silk just made so much sense to me when I first realized what they were developing, because imagine if I want to go to a grocery store and go buy some groceries and use USDC or UST, and all these companies are currently building big data analytic platforms around all this open source data. And I don't want to go to a grocery store, buy a bottle of wine, have to show my ID, and then all of a sudden all my prior banking history is doxed. And so I love that it also gives the opportunity for us to be fully compliant, fully auditable, and that's what's going to bring in the larger users from the Wall Street side as well.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of gives the best of both worlds. Like, it satisfies the like requests of government, so being able to make sure people are being taxed properly, or paying their taxes properly, but it also allows for the complete transactional privacy until the user chooses to unlock or unveil that data, which it's so important. And the more I talk to people about this, the more I'm really realizing that people really do get it. It's just they have to take this leap of faith into the crypto space. Like, I was actually just having a conversation today with a much older person. I think they were in their mid 70s, and I was talking to them about Silk. And as soon as I gave them the example of, if you go to pay for something with a cryptocurrency that doesn't have that transactional privacy, they have access to all your data. And they kind of had a freak out moment, like, what the heck? And so making sure people understand that privacy is this very valuable aspect in blockchain space, but also being able to provide that transparency when needed. So Silk is algorithmically stabilized by Shade. Shade is the governance token for Shade protocol. And we'll go a little bit in depth onto how this algorithmic stabilization occurs. There's two main minting options. And within these minting options, there's an important assumption within the architecture that Silk is worth $1 of Shade over an indefinite period of time, despite peg fluctuations. Two minting options are the Dow Entry method and the conversion minting method. Dow Entry is a one-directional minting process, meaning it can't be converted back. This is where users are depositing or collateralizing. Initially, we can use the example of secret for Silk or for Shade. And so it's called Dow Entry because these uncorrelated assets are being deposited into the Dow or the Shade treasury, which then is able to use that, and they're minting Shade or Silk on the other side. And we'll kind of go back over why this is actually a really cool and unique value proposition for Shade protocol, but you're not causing any inflation without collateral backing, which is really important. But we'll come back to that in a second. The second method is conversion minting. This is where users are either burning Shade to mint Silk or vice versa, burning Silk to mint Shade. And I think it's really important to note that this conversion minting process, in conjunction with like exchange for arbitrage opportunities, is what helps maintain Silk's peg. And like this really is an important note right here. So we'll focus a little bit on the conversion minting aspect right here and why it's a critical portion of the architecture. So give two examples. There's expansion example and contraction example. For the expansion example, imagine that Silk we'll take an arbitrary peg right now, even though this isn't the real peg price of it. But let's say Silk is trading at $1, or that's the peg price. But currently Silk is trading at $1.02 or $1.03. in order to resolve this peg disparity, we're going to need to increase the total supply of silk in order to reduce the price of silk. So that kind of gets facilitated through the following process. So a holder of shade burns $1 worth of shade, mints 1 silk. Holder of silk will then have the opportunity to trade that silk on the market for $1.02. And by doing that, they're exchanging. They can exchange that with really any asset on a AMM. And then that sell pressure created by the conversion minting and expanding the total supply of silk pushes the price of silk back down to its intended target of $1. And then contraction example, which is kind of on the flip side. Imagine the price of silk is trading below its peg price, so like 98, 97 cents. In order to resolve this peg disparity, there needs to be a decrease in the total supply of silk so that the price of silk will come up. And that's facilitated through the following process where a holder of silk will be able to burn 1 silk and mint $1 worth of shade. The holder of the shade will then have the opportunity to trade that amount of minted shade that the market values at 98 cents to any asset available on the AMM. Sell pressure associated with the arbitrage creates a net. Sorry, let me rephrase this. The sell pressure of the arbitrage created by the conversion minting and the decrease in the total supply of silk is what pushes silk's price back up to that intended target of $1. But I do want to point out here that was an arbitrary example. If I'm not mistaken, the actual starting price of silk is going to be $1.05, right?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to make sure and make that clear off the jump. We'll talk more about that once we get into the silk currency basket, but this was just an arbitrary example so people can understand the contraction and expansion examples and how that helps maintain the peg there. So to go back to the Dow Entry minting method, this provides a really unique value proposition for Shade Protocol in that it allows Shade and Silk to be backed by a set of uncorrelated assets within the treasury. And that's really, really important for multiple reasons. One, those uncorrelated assets will be able to potentially provide revenue streams for staking and liquidity providing down the road, making both of those sustainable processes. But it also provides extra stability against any volatility in the market, having all these different uncorrelated assets under the control of the treasury. If my memory serves me correctly, entry minting will most likely be limited to secret, but entry minting can be expanded to additional tokens beyond secret. Like for instance, due to the interoperability with IBC, other tokens such as Secret Atom or Secret Osmo, Secret Luna, any of those types of options could leverage entry minting. And this gives users the ability to directly transfer value into the Shade ecosystem, which it is really cool because there are other processes that are similar to this, but yet they don't have as direct of a transfer of value into the ecosystem as this. Maybe, Erdman, would you be able to provide any sort of additional background here about why that's such a unique value proposition, that direct transfer into the Shade treasury, into the Shade ecosystem?
Yeah, I think you already explained most of it, but I think what we always mention when you're thinking about Silk is that it's super efficient. Over-collateralized stablecoins make it so you have to lock up more liquidity than you're actually getting back, which is of course not the case for an algorithmic stablecoin. So all the liquidity you put in is the same amount of liquidity you get out. But what happens is that you do not only get the value out, but since the assets that are being entry minted into the DAO, so which are now inside the Dow's treasury, the yield on these assets still remains. So if the Dow decides to, I don't know, stake the secret, or Liquidity provide the secret with their own shade, or maybe in the future you will be able to entry mint with other stablecoins like USD, which could use the Anchor protocol, or you would be able to entry mint Ethereum and stake that. Anyway, there are many different possibilities, of course, but the fact pertains that if you entry mint certain assets, that you retain the yield. And since the Silk back is stable in the end, you will create a situation where you have a stable asset because you entry minted a certain asset into the DAO, and then you pertain the yield of this original asset, which was probably very high yield bearing because they are crypto assets, on the stable outcome you get. And this is so mind blowing, which we're already seeing in the Anchor protocol, and I think Shade protocol does only increase this effectiveness even further, because all the new Silk that will be created, or the new shades that will be created over the upcoming years, will be fully backed by, or initially, I guess, fully backed by some sort of yield-bearing asset, which has to go into the DAO. So I'm looking forward to see a situation where you can have a stable asset, but also get, I don't know, 10 to 20 or even 30% yield based on the certain assets that are in the DAO. Or maybe don't even get these yields, but if the DAO saves them up and compounds them, you can create a situation where the DAO eventually has more liquidity inside than that there is Silk value overall. And that way you would have both an algorithmic stablecoin, which is also over collateralized just because of the fact that the DAO has grown and grown over the entire period it's being used.
One of the just to kind of touch on a topic that Carter and I discussed on our last episode was that when they were looking at how they're going to make staking rewards and incentivize liquidity providers, they wanted to make sure that they could do it in a sustainable way that didn't require basically ever going inflation. And so the fact that through this entry minting process, you can build up this set of uncorrelated assets that can generate revenue for staking rewards. So you can properly incentivize people to lock up their shade within the shade staking contract, or properly incentivize people to liquidity provide, and making that all sustainable so that there's no need for an inflation of shade. That was the biggest thing that I took out of this when looking at the entry minting process and why this is so important, because it really does help the protocol reach this sustainable point where it can almost function into perpetuity without needing any of this inflation.
Yeah, you can compare it, for example, to the actual price behind the Bitcoin. Some people often show me this graph where they say over the long term, the price of a Bitcoin is not really the price at the moment, but it's the price what people over all the time have put in fiat value or whatever to buy the Bitcoins that exist today. And I think this value is always like 30% lower or something than the actual price of a Bitcoin at one moment in time. And you create a situation where with shade, where at a certain initial moment this price may be very low, but over the long term the amount of value that is going into shade is higher than the actual price of shade, which is an interesting perspective and makes it way more sustainable than other yield-bearing protocols.
So now we've provided a little bit of background on the different properties of Silk token and some of the architecture there. I really want to get into the interesting stuff. The whole reason we're here to talk today is about Silk Currency Basket. So let's get into it. So Silk aims to overall solve the volatility and sovereign currency risks that single fiat currency stablecoins have by pegging Silk to a basket of global currencies. And before we kind of get into Silk Currency Basket, I was hoping that maybe one of you or Florida Man can talk about some of the variables that impact the volatility of these individual currencies and some of the risks that are involved with using single fiat currency pegs?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Admiral, do you want to take this one, and I'll take the next one here?
Yeah, sure. If I could, I think just in terms of like the list of things that impact volatility is like very, very long,
Yeah.
right? It's as long as like all human activity, basically. But we have basically, we have the monetary side of the economy. You also have the sort of like real or tangible side of the economy, and then you have externalities and external risks. In terms of like the real economy, you have demands for goods or services that the country may be exporting, the degree to which the currency might be dependent on commodity prices. Let's say it's a currency that's very dependent on the price of oil, for example, especially if they're a major exporter or an emerging economy. That might be something that drives a lot of volatility. There's also, of course, like non-market events that can cause volatility. Maybe you have some kind of geopolitical shifts, conflict, some kind of black swan events, things like pandemics, major natural disasters that either, affect that one country and currency specifically, or are a kind of regional phenomenon affecting the whole the currency and all of its major trade partners and economic allies nearby. In terms of monetary policy, like a sovereign government has a huge toolkit at their disposal for influencing the evaluation of a currency, right? And so even in a case, it's not necessarily a case of like weak or strong government monetary policy either. Sometimes a government may be incentivized to, for example, like lower the value of their currency if they're trying to prop up certain export industries, let's say. You also have, government intervention in the form of things like maybe there's tariffs, subsidies, stimulus packages, whatever. These things can lead to things like protracted inflationary periods, which generally bring kind of periods of greater instability or instability in other ways as well that can sort of have a knock-on or a feedback effect. And, I think like within a country too, you have volatility that you maybe don't necessarily notice day to day unless it's extreme. You might kind of experience the slow bleed of value vis-a-vis certain goods due to something like inflation, right? So maybe like, just the price of coffee keeps going up or changes and so on, right? So that's kind of, I think that like internal instability or volatility versus goods also needs to be kept in mind, in addition to our discussion about like the volatility vis-a-vis other currencies. And yeah, I think very much like monetary policy, especially on behalf of governments, is very, very much about trade-offs and balancing interests. It's often designed to benefit certain aspects of the economy and not necessarily like preserve purchasing power for the average consumer, for example. But anyways, there's a lot of different ways we can think about individual currencies within the global economy. I think has a good like an ocean analogy that he's maybe can speak about later. But you can also, I kind of think of it like a set of nodes, each node with kind of localized risks and variables influencing their volatility generally and kind of vis-a-vis each other. Do you have more to say about volatility or variables impacting it?
I think you covered it excellently, and I'll get into some of the analogies of how the capital markets and how money kind of flows from one end to the next in maybe a few minutes here.
Yeah. Just before that, I am curious, just because I've never been a Forex trader. I'm not really aware of what some of the traditional hedging practices are. I'm imagining if you've got a stable coin that's pegged to like a single fiat currency, you're gonna want to have some sort of hedging plan or process. So could one of you maybe talk about what sort of things you would have to do if you were using a single fiat currency stablecoin, and then we can kind of transition that into, how does Silk help fix that problem of needing to constantly worry about hedging against the risks and volatility?
I think that there's a lot of hedging options in Forex. Like you have, foreign currency options, ETF hedges, forward contracts, that kind of thing. Or you could be just sort of manually hedging by holding your own combination of currencies and commodities, right? Certain currencies are also like reactive to one another in terms of monetary policy from governments. If they see themselves sort of rising against another currency, they may react in a certain way. But in terms of consumer choice, right, you have like certain currencies can also act as regional hedges, like maybe the Swiss franc in Europe, or like the Singapore dollar in Southeast Asia. These are commonly used in that case. Maybe you hedge with a currency that's highly correlated with commodities, like the Australian dollar. You have a high correlation with gold, for example. So, okay, we're going to put it there, to try and benefit from gold's role as a sort of traditional hedge. But like largely speaking, I mean, the way to do it is to diversify your value across a set of currencies, right? To hedge, to balance, and reduce volatility. So I think that, like, to move on to what Silk accomplishes. It reduces volatility by operating similarly to how an index of several currencies and a couple commodities, which we'll, I guess, get into a little bit later, but how that would work, right? It has all the benefits. But the additional nice thing is that it has all the benefits of a currency in terms of like usability. You can send and receive it very easily. People can interact with it based on their local reference point and so on. And it's diversified across many economies and many regional networks. When I was kind of like preparing and thinking before this podcast, I was like, I wonder how many international ports are included in our like Silk basket. And it's like 75 of the top 100 ports by like volume, inflow and outflow, right, are included in the currencies that we have in Silk. So that's to say that, it's very diversified and very representative of like sort of more like total global economic activity. And that's great because, when we talk about volatility, these effects are not just something that necessarily affect a single economy, right? These can be regional effects, be it war, natural disaster, economic contagion, or whatever. So yeah, and then these, the currencies within the basket. Another thing I wanted to say is that, these are free floating currencies that are interacting with each other. We'll talk a little bit more about what currencies are chosen and why in a little bit. But each of these currencies has its own specific merits, points of scrutiny, criticism, and so on. There are people who don't like the US dollar at all and don't necessarily want to see it in anything. There are people who don't like the Chinese yuan because of some of their monetary policy and so on. But we have to note that like these are all operating, all the states involved operate using a very similar monetary policy toolkit. Kind of, they all operate on the same spectrum, and they operate reactive and relative to one another. So that the diversity of Silk allows us to basically like compensate for that very specific local risk that you have with any given one, right? By diversifying it across all. And another thing that's demonstrated in the back testing is that Silk does a really good job of like reducing like month on month and year on year volatility compared to an individual currency. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself on that. But yeah, that's kind of this is where I see a lot of the benefits in the Silk model, and we can elaborate more about how we took the original vision of, okay, let's base this around roughly the top 20 economies in the world, and how we sort of narrowed it down to something that we feel is more stable.
Just based off of what you were talking about, these various hedging practices and that Forex traders or individual fiat currency holders might take in order to hedge towards any downside risk. It seems like Silk really simplifies this process. Like for someone that has never had any experience in that, it just makes so much more sense to put money into Silk and let the Silk architecture and the basket do its thing and maintain my purchasing power. But kind of along.
To add to that, so many projects in the crypto ecosystem, they're all about increasing efficiency and reducing unnecessary cost. And in this scenario, where the global economy is becoming more and more intermingled with time, and there's currently many companies that, and beyond just companies, that they're required to have people that sit there and run a trading desk to fulfill orders to help them hedge their currency risk. And it seems that in the times that we are currently with the technologies available, that just doesn't make sense going forward to have to pay somebody to sit there and manage your currency risk. And I'm not trying to claim that Silk is going to solve all these problems, but I think it's a great step forward. And I like to believe that we're one of the first ones to take this type of step forward in the crypto ecosystem.
Yeah.
And it's really exciting to see.
Mm-hmm. If I can add to that, just like personal experience, like my firm, we're not nearly at the size where we need anyone kind of managing our assets for us in that way. But like, okay, I'm Canadian. I use the Canadian dollar. I have to manage all my crypto using like usually US stablecoins as like a reference point. We have like contractors that are in Australia that, you know, we're calculating their local currency, other contractors in other countries. I think that like moving away, so long as you can preserve the lack of volatility, moving away from sovereign currencies is actually not that much of like a user experience leap as people might think, because there's just so much that you have to manage if you are an internationally integrated company or whatever, or even like an individual.
Yeah. So when you guys first started sitting down and thinking about how you're going to take on this task of creating the Silk currency basket, what were some of the first steps that you had to take in order to start generating the ideas of like, you know, what currencies are we going to use? What testing methods are we going to use? What metrics are we most interested? Maybe you guys could provide a little bit of color on how this process started. Like what things were you most interested in to begin with?
Sure. So thankfully, Carter and a lot of the earlier devs had really outlined some fantastic thoughts. And a lot of that was focused around GDP and using a GDP metric, a GDP weighting of the top, I believe at the time it was 20 countries, to provide that diversification. And so we had a good starting point, but we wanted to figure out how to tweak and optimize that a little bit beyond just flat GDP. And some of the first questions that we had to ask ourselves was, what's solid and what do you compare the dollar or the Silk to? Because even as we're aware here in the U.S., the dollar is even a moving target, although because it's what I measure everything with my life in, I see everything else as the moving target, but actually the dollar is also moving. And
that's a phenomenal way to, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that's a phenomenal way to think about that. I've never thought about purchasing power that way.
Yeah. And so it like adds almost a three-dimensional dynamic of, how do you measure something like this? So we kind of sat back and just visualized how capital flows throughout the world. And we landed on, if I live, say, in the United States and I want to measure the depth of the ocean, and I just go out and stake a measuring stick off the East Coast somewhere to measure the depth of the ocean, I'm measuring the tide swings of my local area, and I'm biased on what I'm seeing from my local area. But the capital market moves like the ocean, and it moves like tides move throughout the world as the moon spins. And so we wanted to figure out, how do we measure the entire ocean of capital all at once? And there were a couple ideas that have already been generated that have been used by capital market investors already. And one of them is like the DXY index, which is used to measure the strength of the dollar. And there's a couple other metrics also that we considered, but we landed on, we just found nothing that was suitable that we saw. A lot of them seem kind of archaic and outdated, because these systems, like for example, the DXY, they only update that every 5 years or so. And it's also not measuring all the global currencies. It's measuring just a select few. I believe it's 5 or 6, and the euro is very heavily weighted. So what we decided on was, let's build a benchmark that represents the average of all global currencies that are large and applicable to major economies. And so we took any currency that is greater than 1% of the global GDP, and have included that to create a Fiat global benchmark, is what we called it. And that's our measuring stick that we measure the dollar against, and our back test of the proposed silk peg and performance. I'll pause there if there's any questions, and I think we get deeper into this maybe here in a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, in thinking about it that way, and kind of tying it in with your analogy of the ocean and trying to measure activity in these really small portions, when a lot of this activity is spread across these really wide swaths of space, that makes sense. And especially when you're wanting to when you're trying to create the most stable, or the most a currency that maintains its purchasing power better than any other, you want to make sure you have a benchmark that can reliably be compared to silk. Just because if you just compare silk to any individual sovereign currency, you're going to get different performance data. So it's a good idea to be able to compare it to not only individual currencies, but also this global fiat benchmark that you guys were talking about creating.
Exactly. Yeah.
So would you mind maybe just talking a little bit about some of the aspects of that global fiat benchmark? Like, I know you said any of the currencies that had, was it greater than 1% of the world's total GDP were included in that benchmark?
That's correct. And the reason why we chose any fiat currency that is greater than 1% of the global GDP is because we had to find a way to get quality price data as well. And with some of the very small currencies, very small countries, it's difficult to get that accurate price data and to have the history of the price data to conduct efficient back testing, because we really needed accurate data to go back to about 1995 to give us the back testing that we needed. Yes.
Okay. And just out of curiosity, this is personal curiosity here, what was the thought process behind wanting to make sure that you guys had 25 years of data? Like, why not potentially try and capture 40 years of data and see, or 50 or further back, see how it compared relative to currencies further back in time?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So the modern economy and the global economy has really changed so much since 1995. Part of the reason is just simple enough that there's not accurate price data to go all the way back to, say 1980, 1985 or earlier for some are now in the mix of the global economy, because we've had economies such as China and such as South Korea that they weren't nearly as large, say in the 80s, as they are today. So so it was, a lot of it was for testing purposes, and also from more of a kind of fundamental or theoretical standpoint, I guess you could say, is technology has changed so much over since the internet began that we think that it's fair to measure how the economies and how the currencies interact with each other since we've been in this new technological age rather than before things were so intertwined.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think that the point about technology really starting to change and influence the world in a larger magnitude is an important point. I didn't think about that and why that might play an important role in why certain currencies outperform others. So it's a quality point right there.
Yeah, it was an enjoyable process thinking through this, and it was so fun dealing with people like Admiral and Ederman, who have so much experience in this realm as well, to kind of start from the ground up and say, hey, we don't have to follow anybody else's rules or path that they've already created. We can create our own path, and we're in an entirely new space. So why are we going to try to reinvent something that's already been that's been around for some time and isn't really working the way that maybe people anticipated that it would work? So we try to start with a clean slate, and here's what we've come up with thus far, which we're quite happy with.
Gotcha. So I'd like to cover a little bit more of the details of Silk Currency Basket, and then slowly work our way back to some of the advantages that we started seeing Silk having over some of the competing products. So when you were building and testing Silk Currency Basket, you obviously needed to be able to compare it to something, and the main thing you were interested in comparing it to was this global fiat benchmark. So can you, once you started getting a little bit better idea of what currencies you wanted to include in it, potentially what commodities you might want to include in it, how did you actually go about testing the individual weightings of the different currencies and commodities in these baskets, and what were some of the insights that you were able to derive from some of this back testing?
Sure. So we started out with the mandate, which is to provide a low volatility asset peg. And the second goal was to try to preserve purchasing power as much as we could while staying within a low volatility sphere. So as I mentioned, we originally started just looking at GDP, and then we realized that we wanted to also incorporate slightly more economies that are more efficient and have been better stewards of their currency over the years. So as we walked through it, and I think this started back in late November, and we finally reached a point that we were satisfied with in February. But where it led us to is a split basket approach, where the majority of the basket, part 1 of 3, is based on the GDP weighting. And so what this looks like is we take every country that has a greater than 1% allocation to the global GDP, and that's the weighting that it has for this portion of the basket. And then we add a multiplier to that, which is based on the GDP per capita.
Okay.
And the reason why we wanted to use GDP per capita is because it is an indication of the efficiency and most likely the stability and robustness of a economy. And there are economies who have vast GDPs, such as perhaps China or Russia, or there's many out there that haven't always been good stewards of their currency. So we wanted to try to reduce those a little bit while bolstering up and increasing the allocations towards economies that have been very efficient, which, for example, Switzerland, or even Australia, Canada, Norway. And so let me get back to back this up a little bit. Section 1, basket 1 of 3 of the silk currency peg is the GDP weighted, which then has the multiplier applied of the GDP per capita. Now the second basket is the number 2 of 3 is based on the performers weighting. And how we quantified the performers was if the moving average of the 24-month simple moving average is greater than the 96-month simple moving average. So we did 2 years and a 8-year moving average. And these aren't just moving averages of the local currency divided by the dollar. This is the moving average of the local currency divided by the global fiat benchmark. And this is important to note because we're not optimizing to beat the dollar, because there's no way to know for sure that the dollar will always be, in the long run, the standard. So we're optimizing to beat the global average. And if a country's currency has outperformed per our metrics of the 2-year moving average being over the 8-year moving average, then it will be added to this basket of performers. And this basket of performers is representative of good stewards who have been good stewards of their currency. And that is currently weighted at approximately 20% of the overall silk peg basket. And finally, the last basket, the third basket, is centered around commodities, and particularly gold and Bitcoin as of now. We settled on 5% allocated towards gold and 2% allocated towards Bitcoin. And I would like to note that we did our very best not to opt to overfit or to cherry pick the data and assume that we would have gotten in Bitcoin way earlier than we probably would have. So Bitcoin was added in actually at its 2017 peak, because I wanted to see what would happen worst case scenario. Mm-hmm. And gold has, so there's a total of a 7% allocation towards the overall silk peg, towards these hard assets that provide us the inflation hedge protection. So I'll pause there if there's any questions.
I like it. I personally think it's a great idea to have that, like that third basket be the inflation hedge, just because you've got the individual sovereign currency hedging, like having this composition of multiple individual fiat currencies provides some hedging in between the individual ones, but then you also have this inflation hedge that's kind of a hedge against all of these currencies. And I think it's a really good idea. I assumed you guys would have done this anyways, just because you want to make sure that silk performs in the worst economic conditions possible and also in the best economics conditions possible. Because it would be easy for us to pick the best charts to make silk look like it's performing really, really good. But I think the testimony to how silk performs is what is silk doing whenever the rest of the world's economy is like taking a big crap. And so you've gone through that back testing. What was the worst drawdown that you've seen whenever you pair Bitcoin's largest drawdown and gold's most recent drawdown?
Sure. Yeah. So assuming that, all right, let's see here. So with the inflation hedge assets comes a little bit of added volatility, which we're trying to stay away from volatility. But we wanted to make sure that it was an acceptable level. And under a bad case scenario, if we assume gold had the greatest drawdown it's had in 20 years' time, and if Bitcoin simultaneously had the greatest drawdown it's had since its existence, and assuming that both of those would happen at the same time, even though currently gold and Bitcoin are not, they're not positively correlated really often. One is up when the other is down. The entire silk basket would have a 385 basis point, so a 3.85% drawdown. And we accepted this risk because what this provides us, or what it has provided us in the back test, is approximately a 8 to 9% value preservation over the backtest period, which was 2010 to 2022 and 2016 to 2022. And I'll go into why we chose those timeframes. So the hard assets are weighted at that amount. That's what we visualize currently as the kind of max risk there. And it is important to note also that if gold and Bitcoin were both to take significant drawdowns, the economic conditions that would bring that to be the case would very likely make the dollar, the euro, the yuan all be rather strong, because most likely that would signal that there is a liquidity crisis of some type, which then a lot of funds would flood into these more reserve, non-emerging market type currencies.
Yeah. So I think this is actually a really good place to tie in one of the major advantages I think that the silk currency basket has is its ability to be flexible and reactive to what's going on in the world economy. And it kind of makes me think about a question I had initially in a statement I heard Carter say was, we want to stay away from speculation territory. Like, even if we think there are certain inflation hedges that function as really good stores of value, we don't want to make the portion of their silk currency basket that large, because we don't want there to be that much of a gain in purchasing power where you're kind of getting into speculation territory. But you still have that ability to change the weightings, whether it be for these inflation hedges or whether it's changing the composition of your good stewards basket or the GDP per capita basket. That flexibility is going to be really crucial for silk being able to maintain that purchasing power and continue outperforming the global fiat benchmark.
Yep, absolutely. I think you nailed it. And just to touch on here, the exact numbers over the past 20 years, a weighting of this amount to gold and then the eventual addition of Bitcoin preserved 9.28% value to the overall peg. So it helped the silk peg with the hard assets, beat the global fiat benchmark by an additional 9.28%.
Here, I can pull up that the screen of the composition and back testing if you want, so it'll be a little bit easier for people to visualize.
And Erderman or Admiral, do you all have anything to throw in here while I'm before I go over the Excel spreadsheet?
Yeah, I have a few comments just when we get to like the specific countries that are included, but nothing until then.
Okay.
I will add a quick comment for anyone who's curious as to the value of silk as in how silk is also an inflation hedge, or how much it's an inflation hedge. We had a lot of discussions in the back Discord with many members of of which some stated that silk should preserve all its purchasing power, and that meant that it should outpace inflation. And some people went ahead and created a graph for this, and this was actually really interesting. Some user managed to use some specific data feeds which are readily available every month to create a silk pack, which goes up, I think, like 8% every year. So it would outpace the S&P 500 with really no risk at all, which is kind of crazy. But we just quickly want to highlight here that the entire silk pack in the end is based on currency data and currency price. It's not related to any inflation data, monetary supply, money supply, M1, M2, or whatever, because like Florida Man already stated, and how Carter's vision and other Shade members' team's vision is as well, is that silk should be stable enough for you to use as a currency, and it should not be hoarded to become a speculative asset. The goal is to have as low volatility as possible and make it usable in the global trade. So if you're interested in this, a small alpha might be that there can be a version 2 if you're willing to work on this. Maybe we'll discuss this later, but for now, the pack is focused on currencies only.
And I think this is a good point for us to, before we really get into the Excel spreadsheet, I'm just curious what you guys think, based on everything that you've seen and done working on the PEG research. What do you think the biggest advantages that the silk currency basket has over some of the competing products? Like, obviously, silk is helping solve some of the volatility and individual sovereign currency risks. And I'm just curious, just because we all have different backgrounds, I'm curious as to what you guys see as one of the bigger advantages. Just because, personally, because I had no background knowledge or experience in Forex market and understanding hedging practices, one of the biggest advantages, in my opinion, is that silk acts as this perpetual hedge instrument due to the nature of the basket. And also its ability to be deployed today while escaping the majority of regulatory scrutiny, which, I mean, we could go into that last part a whole bunch, just being able to be outside the majority of regulatory scrutiny. But I'm interested to hear what you guys think are the major advantages that you've seen in working on the PEG research.
Yeah, I think for me, I was asking myself this question all along because it has to be something that I believe someone in a second or third world country would want to hold it, as well as somebody in a first world country would want to hold it. And it shouldn't matter if they're on one side of the world or another. It also needs to be something that I personally would want to hold and that I would feel comfortable telling my parents to hold. And I think why I feel strongly about this is because I know that given the makeup of the PEG, I will preserve purchasing power while having, compared to other single fiat currencies, while having the lowest possible volatility available in Forex markets. And so I can purchase it and leave it for 10, 20, 30, 50 years because I can trust that there's going to be a group of analysts in the Dow that are committed to always updating this PEG and keeping it aligned with the best interests of the holders. And so, yeah, I think it's just that I don't have to worry. I can just hold it, and I don't have to worry, is my purchasing power going to be there a year, 5, 10 years from now?
And I think just to highlight one of the final things you said there was the ability for the composition and the weightings to be changed over time. Like, that's a really big thing, and it's done through governance. So it's done with the support of the community, which kind of brings the whole thing full circle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think if I can add to that too, like, this is kind of less tangible or practical of a strength, but I just think it's kind of interesting and unique. It's kind of like an experiment, and it's kind of a bold project, like everybody and their dog has like a US dollar stablecoin now, right? But this is actually something that kind of stands out from the crowd a little bit. And for me, that's like kind of what at least drew me to the project initially. And then, kind of through the hard work and impressive work of all of various people, I think that we kind of were able to prove that it has a reasonable and like a strong value proposition as well. So I just think, personally, I just think it's kind of cool as well.
What about you, Arabin? What do you think is the biggest advantage that the Silk currency basket has over stablecoins pegged to individual sovereign currencies?
Yeah, so I will not go into what I think the abilities of Shader. Just regarding the pack, I think the interesting part is that it's not backed by any single stablecoin, and that may seem really obvious, but the end result is that Silk would be spendable in the end. You see now clearly that as soon as US stablecoins are being spended, that the government doesn't like it, because there is money being created, not out of thin air, but it is being created, and it's not being created by the central bank, which basically they lose power over their own economy, which is extremely scary for big countries like the United States or any given country, actually. And if Silk would gain a lot of adoption, then everybody could spend it, and it doesn't impact any single currency which is held by a certain economy. And I think that's the power of Silk at this moment, and mostly for the future.
Yeah, and I can't help but think about the risk that some of these US dollar pegged stablecoins are going to face, especially as the US government continues looking more into creating their own central bank digital currency. Obviously, there's going to be like conflict of interest there and potential problems in the future. So the fact that Silk is an index currency kind of puts it outside of that regulatory risk, where it's not a direct fiat derivative. So there's not as much, I guess, conflict or problems that individual governments have.
It has kind of an interesting interaction with government monetary policy, actually, because we have that preference for good stewards built into it, right? So like as a country, as the GDP per capita increases, as they sort of develop a more robust monetary policy, their currency should theoretically take like a larger share of Silk over time. So it has this kind of actually interesting interaction where it like rewards good currency management on the part of governments in terms of the representation.
And this is unlike what the sort of influence that countries can have over their the composition of the basket. Like I can't help but think about the IMF and looking at. I'm blanking right now on the index currency that they've created. But essentially there's there is an incentive for countries to try and increase their contributions or their weightings in some of these really widely adopted index currencies. And I think that it's really cool that one of the best ways that these countries can increase their weighting or participation in the composition is by being good stewards of their currency, like doing what they're supposed to do.
Would you mind if I just add a little bit more to that?
Yeah.
So on the GDP side of the basket, a country can increase their weighting by either increasing their GDP, which is quite obvious, or by increasing their efficiency and having a higher GDP per capita, which, although China currently is weighted at 7.13%, mostly due to their low GDP per capita, as they continue to consistently grow both their GDP and GDP per capita, then their weight will be significantly increased. And on the other side, with the performance weighting, we wanted to give smaller economies a chance to have a slightly larger proportion or a decent sized share weighting in the basket that maybe their GDP alone wouldn't allow for. And we chose the 2-year and 8-year simple moving average based around business cycles, which are typically 8.5 years, a boom and bust business cycle in the economy, and also election cycles. And the 2 and 8-year were chosen to catch large long-term moves in economic strength. Economies don't rise and fall in a matter of months. It takes years. And so this flexibility with the performance basket has in the past, during the backtest, captured the long-term moves of economies as they improve their stewardship.
That makes sense. Well, we can go ahead and start getting into the Excel sheet. I know, at least personally for me, it's always easier to understand topics if I can visualize them, and Silk Currency Basket is definitely one of those for me. So being able to see how the total composition is kind of broken down and being able to visualize its performance through some of the different back testing that you guys have done, I think that will really help out everybody in trying to understand the full composition of the basket. So
sure, be happy to. So what you see on the top chart, and I'll zoom in a little bit, is the back test from 2010 to 2022. And the reason why we started in 2010 is really dual purpose. So one, we needed enough previous data to get to this point of 2010, because it takes approximately 15 years of data to generate the proper Silk Fiat currency benchmark, the global fiat currency benchmark. It takes about 15 years of data to generate that. And secondly, and more importantly, we wanted to measure how Silk would perform against the dollar, which is the current standard by many people's view, during the dollar's strongest period. And what we demonstrated here in the 2010 to 2022 back test is, although the dollar coming out of the great financial crisis did really gain strength and gain steam compared to the other currencies in approximately 2014 and 15, the Silk peg was able to, with time, grow very close to match the dollar's performance during the best period that the dollar has ever had. And not only did it perform very similarly to the dollar, but it did it with much less volatility. So on the left, under the 2010 section, backtest section, we have the standard deviation of which measures the volatility. And we can see that the dollar, compared to the fiat benchmark basket, is approximately 27%, while the Silk volatility is only 16.8%. And it's important to note that on the dollar's path to its climb coming out of the great financial crisis, it actually had a pretty sizable drawdown of approximately 7 to 8%. And the Silk peg did not have a drawdown ever below its initial starting point, and its largest drawdown was approximately 3%. Now, I'll stop here if you have any questions on the longer term backtest.
I was just going to say, looking at that first graph right there, the thing that sticks out to me is you can see when the dollar really starts to lose some of its value, and seeing that Silk is able to resist that downside risk is phenomenal, even though it might not have as quick of an upside reaction. That the point that you made where it never dipped below its inception price, I think is a really important note to highlight.
Sure. Yep. And I would, when you compare the dollar to all of the other currencies in the world based on our proprietary GDP basket, it really demonstrates how much the dollar does fluctuate. And living in the U.S., it's surprising to me. It was surprising to me whenever I built this, how much the dollar has fluctuated since 2010. And so we wanted to also measure a more fair representation of how silk performs during a period of time when the dollar had zero net change throughout the course of the period of the test. So for this to take place, we measured against the dollar from 2015. So really it was December 31st, 2015, up until December 31st, 2021. And the numbers here looked much, much better. And I think this is a more fair test that demonstrates what I would hope and expect to see silk mirror in the coming years. And with this test, we had a very similar volatility, 12% versus the dollar's almost 11%. And to note, this volatility came from the upside volatility. So it had this slight 2% greater volatility than the dollar because it held its value much better than the dollar. But overall, very low volatility still. And the metrics that I was most interested in comparing at the end of the day was the volatility adjusted return. So this is taking the overall return and dividing it by the amount of volatility.
Okay. And
so we can see that with the 2016 test, there was a volatility adjusted return of 254%, while the dollar was actually negative because it lost value on average during that time. Excuse me, not on average. It did lose value at the end of the day. Now, during the longer term test, the silk vol adjusted return was 396% compared to the dollar's 219%. And with this, basically, the higher number, the better. It means you're preserving your value with as little volatility as possible. And that's what we were optimizing for.
And you were, so you can optimize for volatility adjusted return. Are you able to, I'm assuming what you're trying to minimize is that downside volatility, right?
Right. Yep.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. So in looking at this graph, it's much easier to see the diversification present, specifically looking at the pie graph that shows the breakdown of the full composition. It's also a lot easier to internalize the idea that silk reduces volatility after seeing some of these back tests and how it performed under different economic conditions. I think comparing it to the US dollar when it had basically its greatest rally in history and still seeing that almost same sort of performance, but none of that downside risk. Like you said, you're trying to minimize that downside volatility. And then also seeing where the dollar really doesn't change in value or it actually slightly goes down in value. This is where you see silk really outperform the individual fiat currency.
Yep. And one thing I would like to note as well, this blue line is the silk fiat portion alone, because we wanted to see how much are the inflation hedge assets, the hard assets, bringing to the table, and how much is derived simply from the currency selection. And so that blue line is no inflation hedge assets. That would be what Silk Peg would be without the hard assets, gold and Bitcoin. And what I find interesting is, yes, it is very low volatility, and also during a period where the dollar was flat or as close to flat as we can find over the past 20 years, the Silk plain fiat still slightly beat the dollar while providing lower volatility.
So this is just out of curiosity. When you started doing these back test models, did you start out with just a fiat portion, or did you already have in your mind you wanted to include commodities or like these inflationary hedge items within the basket?
Yeah. So we knew we wanted to include some percent to hard assets. However, I would say 80 to 90% of our work was all centered around how do we structure the fiat portion.
Yeah.
And because that's, at minimum 90%, currently it's set at 93% of the basket, and it's what's bringing the stability. So yeah, the majority of our work was around the fiat, and then towards the end, it was a decision of, okay, how much, what's our risk reward trade-off that we're willing to accept with the intent of keeping low vol, and then what percent do we set the gold and Bitcoin to at that point?
Gotcha.
Yeah, just to add to that, if I can, like we had some early experimentations. We were looking at it, and like we always had the idea of having hard assets in the beginning, but like really didn't want to build a basket where like the fiat portion of it is not actually performing well, and we're just totally relying on hard assets to carry the value over time, right? So like Kyle said, the focus was on fixing or solving the Silk fiat portion first, and then seeing how we can incorporate hard assets rather than using them as like a crutch, basically.
So I've just got, I'm curious about what you guys think is the biggest or easiest takeaway for a user, like if a new user who's wanting to understand the Silk currency basket and the peg, and they get access to this Excel workbook, what things would you like to highlight and say, like, it is best for you to understand these portions? Like if you're going to just devote a small amount of time to understanding this, what are the most important things to understand about either the back testing, the composition, or any of the return data?
Yeah, I think it would be fun for people to hop in. The worksheet is going to be available under the PEG Research channel on the Shade Discord channel, and play around with the numbers up at the top left, where you can change the GDP weighting, the performers weighting, the gold and Bitcoin weighting. And my gut tells me that this will be up for vote by the Dow in the months or maybe later in the year moving forward, of do we want to change these weightings later on or for 2023. And so kind of experiment with that, and then also just be aware that previous performance on a back test doesn't indicate future results. There's always unknowns. It's the global economy is constantly evolving, but thankfully through back testing we can test as many different scenarios as possible. And if somebody has mad Python computer programming that's worked with a hedge fund in the past or done FX trading as a career or something like that, like by all means, we would love to have you come aboard and contribute to the PEG Research channel. And that's what makes it fun. And we enjoy being challenged by other people's well thought out responses and comments, and iron sharpens iron. So it's always a good thing.
Yeah. And I know, if my memory serves me correctly, Erdogan, you've done a fair bit of back testing and playing around with the workbook.
Well, not with the workbook specifically. That's really
okay.
Kyle's play. And I guess the other contributors started with an Excel sheet. But I've started a Python library. It's available on GitHub. It's still private, but people can contribute to it if I see more people coming into the PEG research channel, which is for now basically emulating the workbook which is created. So it has certain functions which make it so that you can calculate where the basket is going dependent on certain currency data. And you can also import other data to see how it's performing and calculate some like metrics, as in, is it deviating, is it going up comparison to the basket, etc. And then my idea is to make several different baskets. So it will have functions which can take some sort of data and not only create this benchmark which Florida Man has created, but also other benchmarks which people want to have. And then for someone or for me to implement a method which will do out of sample testing. So that would mean that you use an X amount of years of data to calculate what your basket should be, and you use some other years which you have not used to create the model to test the model. And the main limitation on this is that we only have so much data. Really only like 25 years of reliable data for all the currencies which we're using. So if we want to do some out of sample testing, that means we have to use simpler baskets or consider creating the basket for only 10 years or 5 years and then testing it on 5 more. So we do have to, it's not possible to out of sample test the full 20-year model which Florida Man has created. That's sad, but that's how data availability works, and we have to work around that, I guess. I do feel the backtest is done properly. Like every year, basically Florida Man started from the perspective where, okay, I am in this year, how would I change the basket now? Then I change it. And then, okay, now I'm in the second year, how do I change the basket? And then I change it. So it would be similar to how governance is using it. So in that sense, the backtest fully makes sense and it's correct and it's very good. But we do need or want some out of sample testing. I've been very busy, but luckily we still have a few months before Silk launches. So I hope to get this library off the ground and get some more people working on it. Maybe even people from the Shade team themselves. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think this is a perfect place to transition into talking about what work still needs to be done with the Silk PEG. Obviously, you were talking about needing to do ample back testing, but is there anything else you guys know that you're going to need to finalize or continue working through before you all give it the thumbs up, like it's ready to go, the PEG's ready to go?
So currently we've voted on and we feel good about the PEG as it is now for the launch. And with the excitement that it will be evolving and people, other people smarter than us hopefully will come aboard and contribute and generate new ideas. And I think, as Erderman said, the best way that we can test this moving forward is out of sample data, and we need to develop some framework on exactly what that looks like and how that's going to be accomplished.
So for new users that either people who are new to Shade Protocol and want to get involved in helping the project out, or people who are particularly interested in helping out with the Silk PEG. For anyone that's interested in basically helping out, what are the first steps that they can take to getting involved with the PEG research team? And then how can they start interacting?
I think the first step would just be to drop some comments that you're interested in assisting in the PEG research channel. And then after that, we'll start get back to our weekly meetings, and we can all discuss ideas and findings at that point.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. Like this whole study from the beginning is like it's like a living document or something, where there's like certain people who have kind of come and gone and made interesting contributions at different stages. So like, I just encourage people to jump into the conversation at any point. Like definitely do your best to try and catch up on the conversation that came before. I mean, hopefully this podcast gives people like a resource so they have a good starting point. But yeah, just kind of join in and interact with us.
Yeah, I will say, coming from the standpoint of a community member who at one point was not involved with the protocol at all, like it can be intimidating to start interacting with some people who have really high level skills or high level education. But I do want to highlight that there might be one outlier, but pretty much everyone that I've interacted with within the Shade protocol, whether it's people focusing on building out core primitives or it's groups of community members working on things like the Silk Peg, if you are willing to put in the work and are willing to put in the effort needed to understand this, that those teams are more than willing to help kind of bring you in amongst them and allow you to contribute. Like they actively welcome you to contribute. This is going to be a much bigger project than something that just Florida Man and Admiral and Airman can handle. And obviously, I'm just saying that just because you guys are here. I know there are a few other key contributors to the PEG research team. But I just say this to make sure that anyone who is interested in joining the PEG research team in just asking questions, starting to generate conversations, or maybe even trying to help build out some of the things within the PEG, just start asking questions and get involved. I would say the best place to do that is definitely on Shade Protocol's Discord within the PEG research channel. And I'm assuming that this workbook and the Silk Peg proposal are both going to be posted in the Discord channel, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Yeah. So individuals can go look at this. You can see all the data that's available here. And like Florida Man was saying, you have the ability, once you have these documents, you can start plugging and playing with different numbers, start generating your own back testing. And, if you find something interesting that performs a little better, or a scenario that you think it needs to be looked at a little bit more, this would be a great first place to start getting involved.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that contributed. If I can just mention, like Mangifi, or Aju, at different points we had like Mizan is in the conversation, Vendible Chris. There's a lot of people that joined in at different points and made like significant contributions to this and even things that like I produce things that we just didn't end up using as well, right? Like it's like there's going down those research threads helps contribute to the overall product as we sort of decide, say yes to something or prove that it's not a good idea. So I really encourage everyone to to contribute and so on.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah. Please keep challenging us. We have some great minds and people from various different cultures and countries with different policies trying to pick our brains on why we made certain choices. And that's just really good for the end result. We had some people who were endlessly complaining about why we didn't include a certain inflation hedge or currency or whatever, and that is the kind of discussion we want to grow further. So even if you don't want to contribute or just discuss or complain, then please come, because even that is a contribution in its own right and is helping the team to make better decisions.
I think that's actually a really good point to make, just because even just starting a simple discussion can provide insight into something that some of the core team members might not have thought about. I know there are a few things that we've talked about in the past on some of the PEG research calls where I might not fully understand, all of the inner workings behind, but I am able to think critically and ask questions, and sometimes those questions bring out interesting solutions or interesting idea threads that could potentially help down the line. So I definitely encourage anyone that's interested in being involved to get involved. And with that, we're just crossed over an hour and a half. So I think we'll end it here for this episode. I want to thank you guys for joining and providing clarity on the inner workings and some of the developmental logic behind what I anticipate will be one of the most notable DeFi products of 2022. I mean, personally, I seriously think that Silk is going to be such an important aspect of DeFi in the future. And that's nothing but good news for Shade Token and Shade Protocol and all individuals who are wanting to preserve their purchasing power in the best way possible. I want to say I personally look forward to continuing to collaborate with the team. I know a lot of the other members of the House of Shade podcast team have been involved with some of the discussions going on in the PEG Research Discord channel, and we all look forward to continuing to collaborate with the team and providing input to help try and continually improve the end product. Just want to note right here at the end that if you guys do want to stay up to date with everything concerning the Silk PEG research, I highly recommend you join the Shade Protocol Discord server and check out the PEG research channel and kind of just a little bit away from Silk and just more focused on Shade. There's going to be a lot of updates coming out Shade Protocol development over the next few weeks. So make sure to follow them on Twitter, join their Discord, join their Telegram. Make sure you're staying up to date on everything new. There's going to be a lot of really interesting information being dropped soon. So with that, thank you guys for tuning in. Bye, everybody.